In the cold blue light of dawn, the silence was the most terrifying thing. Smoke, thick and oily, clung to the valley floor, a greasy shroud over the ruins of 3 homesteads. From his own small cabin perched on a rise, Caleb could see the skeletal remains of Jarvis's barn, its timbers blackened and reaching like charred fingers toward a pitiless sky. The raiders had come and gone in the night, a phantom squall of violence, and where there had been life and laughter, there was now only this profound, chilling quiet. His own home was untouched, his stores were full, his small world was intact, not because of luck, but because of a hole in the ground that everyone had called an act of madness. They had walked right over it, a dozen desperate men, their boots pressing the damp moss into the hidden lid of his salvation, and had never known it was there. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of quiet ingenuity and frontier resilience resonate with you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more compelling. The obsession had taken root 5 years earlier, in the bitter winter that followed a different raid. That one had been smaller, quicker, almost surgical in its cruelty. There had been only 4 of them, their faces gaunt with hunger. They had not been interested in violence for its own sake, only in survival. They had broken the simple lock on the smokehouse and taken the hams. They had kicked in the door of the springhouse, and then, with an ease that haunted Caleb's dreams, they had found the root cellar. His wife, Mary, had been inside the cabin, her hands trembling as she held the heavy iron poker from the hearth. Caleb had been in the woods, checking his trap lines, a fool's errand that left his home vulnerable. When he returned, the men were gone. The snow was trampled with their tracks, leading away from the cellar's slanted plank doors. One of the doors was splintered, its leather hinge torn. Inside, the shelves were bare. They had taken everything: the sacks of potatoes and turnips, the strings of dried onions, the precious barrels of salted pork and preserved beans, the crocks of apple butter. They had taken the year's labor and left behind nothing but empty space and the cold, earthy smell of despair. Mary had tried to be strong. They had rationed what little remained in the cabin pantry. Caleb had hunted relentlessly, but the game was scarce that winter, the deer driven to lower elevations by the deep snows. He brought back squirrels and rabbits, thin, stringy creatures that offered little sustenance. Mary grew thin, her cheeks hollowing. A cough settled deep in her chest, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the barrenness of their cellar. She wasted away not from a sudden sickness, but from a slow, grinding starvation, a weakening of the body that left it with no defense against the cold. She died in the early spring, just as the first thaw was beginning, her last breath a faint wisp in the frigid air of the cabin. In the weeks that followed her burial on the hill behind their home, Caleb did not just grieve, he analyzed. He sat at his small table, staring at the splintered cellar door he had since replaced. He saw it not as an act of God or a stroke of bad luck, but as a failure of design, a catastrophic, fatal failure of imagination. The cellar was built to keep vegetables from freezing, not to keep desperate men out. Its doors were angled against the hill for easy access with a wheelbarrow, which also made them a clear and obvious target. The hinges were external, easily broken. The lock was a simple wooden bar. It was a pantry, not a fortress. He looked around the valley at his neighbors' homesteads. Everyone had the same design: a slanted door on a hillside, a stone-lined pit, a simple bar lock. They were all copies of one another, a tradition passed down without question. They were all vulnerable. The thought settled in him, cold and heavy as a river stone. The problem was not the raiders. They were a fact of life, like harsh winters or summer droughts. The problem was the universal, unthinking acceptance of a flawed system. His neighbors mourned their losses after a raid, cursed the perpetrators, and then rebuilt the exact same vulnerability. They accepted the risk as inevitable. Caleb could not. Mary's death was not inevitable. It was the result of a design flaw, and a design flaw could be fixed. This realization was his epiphany. It was a cold, bitter comfort, but it set his jaw and hardened his eyes. He would not be a victim of tradition. He would build something that worked. His life changed. The rhythms of the seasons, which had once dictated his every action, now became secondary to his singular focus. He still planted a small garden and hunted for the table, but the trapping that provided his meager cash income ceased entirely. He no longer spent evenings by the fire carving axe handles or mending harnesses. Instead, he walked. He spent his days exploring the hollows and ridges, not with a rifle, but with the searching eyes of an engineer. His young son, Samuel, barely a man at 15, watched him with a quiet concern. His father had grown distant, his gaze fixed on something Samuel could not see. Caleb became a student of the earth. He studied the way water carved channels through rock, the immense, patient power of erosion. He examined the root systems of ancient oaks, great wooden knuckles gripping the soil, creating a structure far stronger than the tree itself. He lay on his stomach for hours, watching foxes disappear into dens, with entrances so cleverly concealed they were nearly invisible from a few feet away. Nature, he realized, was a master of defense and concealment. It did not build obvious doors. It used misdirection, camouflage, and the strength of the surrounding landscape. His research took him farther afield. He traveled for 2 days to the site of an old, abandoned colonial fort, a place whispered about by trappers. It had been overrun a generation ago, a testament to failure. But in its failure, Caleb sought lessons. He walked the perimeter of the rotted palisade, noting how the attackers had exploited the corners, the weakest points. He saw the remains of their shallow trenches and realized the attackers had used the earth as a shield. The fort's defenders had built their walls high, trying to fight gravity and exposure. The attackers had built their trenches low, cooperating with the land. On his journey home, he sought out an old trapper named Finch, a man who had lived among the Iroquois as a boy and was said to have forgotten more about the wilderness than most men ever knew. Caleb found him in a smoky, hide-covered lean-to, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. Caleb did not speak of his loss or his plan. He simply asked, how did they keep their food safe for the winter? Finch looked at him with cloudy blue eyes, then spat a stream of tobacco juice near the fire. They didn't build a barn for it, if that's what you mean, he rasped. A barn's a signpost for man and beast, says, food here. No, they dug deep. He described the caches he had seen as a boy. Bell-shaped pits, dug into clay soil, their walls hardened with fire. They would fill them with grain and dried meat, cover the opening with a layer of bark and grass, and then replace the topsoil so perfectly that no one could tell the ground had ever been disturbed. They were deep, hidden, and relied on the earth itself for protection. This was a vital piece of the puzzle, but Caleb saw a weakness. A deep pit was hidden, but if found, it was still just a pit. Once the top was opened, the contents were exposed. It was concealment, but not defense. As he walked home, his mind wrestled with the two ideas: the interlocking strength of the tree roots and the deep, hidden design of the Iroquois cache. He crested a ridge and looked down into his own valley. The answer struck him then, a flash of insight so clear and powerful it made him stop in his tracks. He would not just dig a hole, he would build a structure inside the hole. He would not rely on concealment alone, but on a combination of concealment and impenetrable structure. He envisioned a cylinder of logs, laid horizontally and interlocked at the joints, like a log cabin built underground. The immense pressure of the surrounding earth, which would crush a conventional square frame, would only serve to tighten and strengthen this woven cylindrical design. The entrance would not be a simple lid. It would be a multi-layered system, a puzzle of earth, stone, and wood. He returned to his cabin with a feverish energy. Samuel saw the change immediately. The haunted, wandering look was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. Caleb unrolled a piece of birch bark and, using a charred stick from the fire, began to sketch. He drew circles and cross-sections, calculating angles and depths. The next morning, he packed a mule with his few valuable furs and told Samuel he was going to the trading post, a journey of 3 days. He returned not with flour or salt, but with a collection of tools that baffled his son. He had a heavy-duty block and tackle with thick hemp rope, 2 spoon augers with extra-long shafts, and a bundle of flat iron straps punched with holes. To Samuel, they were just strange and expensive tools. To Caleb, they were the key to building the impossible. The work began on a gentle, unremarkable slope behind the cabin, dotted with young poplars and thick undergrowth. It was a place one's eye would slide over without a second thought, which was precisely why Caleb chose it. He and Samuel cleared a wide circle, stripping away the topsoil and moss with painstaking care, setting it aside on oiled deer hides to keep it alive. Then they began to dig. It was brutal, punishing labor. The soil was rocky and dense with roots. They used pickaxes to break the earth and shovels to heave it into woven baskets, which Samuel would haul to the surface. They did not dig a simple shaft. Following Caleb's charcoal sketches, they dug a pit that widened as it deepened, forming the bell shape the trapper had described. This shape, Caleb explained to his son, was crucial. It meant the walls of their structure would be pushing against undisturbed, compacted earth, not loose backfill. Day after day, they descended deeper into the ground, the circle of sky above them shrinking. The air grew cool and damp, smelling of stone and clay. While the digging continued, Caleb selected the trees. He needed hardwood, dense and resistant to rot. He chose black locust and white oak, felling them with a new precision. He was not just making logs, he was milling components. He and Samuel worked together, using a pit saw to square the logs on two sides, leaving the other two rounded. This would allow them to fit snugly together while maintaining the immense compressive strength of their natural form. Each log was cut to a precise length, forming a segment of a perfect circle. When the pit was finally deep enough, a full 12 feet from the surface, the construction began. This was where Caleb's strange tools came into play. Using the block and tackle rigged to a heavy tripod of logs, they carefully lowered the first ring of squared timbers into the bottom of the pit. Then, using the long-shafted augers, Caleb bored deep holes through the ends of each log. He carved heavy wooden pegs from seasoned hickory and drove them home, locking the ring together. The next layer was laid on top, staggered like bricks in a wall. Again, he drilled and pegged them, not just to each other, but to the layer below. He was not building a wall, he was weaving a basket of wood. The structure rose from the floor of the pit, a solid, interlocking cylinder of timber. It was slow, meticulous work. Each log had to be measured, cut, and fitted perfectly. The rounded outer edges pressed against the earthen walls of the pit, while the flat inner sides formed a smooth, continuous surface. When the woven cylinder reached the top of the bell and entered the narrower shaft, Caleb changed the technique. Here, the logs were fitted even more tightly, forming a thick, impenetrable neck. As they worked, they began backfilling, shoveling the excavated earth into the gap between the log cylinder and the pit wall. Caleb insisted they do this layer by layer, compacting the soil with heavy wooden tampers. "The earth has to be our ally," he told Samuel, his voice echoing in the confined space. "It must hold the logs, not crush them. We are giving it a skeleton to grip." The community, which had at first paid little mind to Caleb's project, now began to take notice. The mountain of excavated dirt was enormous. The sight of Caleb and his son disappearing into a hole in the ground each morning was deeply strange. Jarvis, his closest neighbor and a man who placed great stock in common sense, was the first to voice his concerns. He strode over one afternoon, a frown etched on his face. "Caleb," he said, peering down into the dark opening, "what in God's name are you doing? Digging a well?" "Storing supplies," Caleb replied without looking up, his voice muffled by the earth. Jarvis scoffed. "You've been digging for a month. A root cellar takes a week. You're wasting the best part of the season. Are you building a burrow for yourself? Afraid of the sunshine?" He shook his head, a mixture of pity and scorn in his eyes. He walked back to his own homestead and told his wife that Caleb had finally lost his mind to grief. The name stuck. Neighbors began referring to the project as Caleb's Folly. Some called it the Ground Mole's Palace. The mockery was quiet at first, but it grew. Children would sometimes creep to the edge of the woods to watch the madman and his boy toil at their pointless hole. Caleb heard the whispers. He saw the looks. He ignored them. His focus was absolute, his persistence a force of nature in itself. He was consumed by the geometry of his creation, the precise fit of each joint, the satisfying thud of the hickory pegs. His hands were raw, his muscles screamed with fatigue, but his mind was clear. He was not just building a cellar, he was building an argument against fate. He was building a monument to his wife's memory, crafted from logic, sweat, and wood. The final piece of the design was the entrance, and it was here that the true genius of the system lay. The top of the log shaft ended 3 feet below the surface of the ground. Caleb built a heavy, reinforced hatch to seal the opening. It was not simple planking. He laminated 3 layers of thick oak boards, arranging the grain of each layer perpendicular to the one below it. He then bolted them together and bound the edges with the iron straps he had purchased, creating a small, immensely strong door. He set it into a frame of locust wood, fitting it with a hidden, internal locking mechanism that could only be operated from below. But this door was only the first line of defense. Above it, he laid a series of heavy, flat field stones, fitting them together like a puzzle to form a solid stone roof over the hatch, leaving only a small, disguised gap through which one could reach the lock. Finally, he took the preserved topsoil he had set aside months before and carefully replaced it over the stones. He replanted the moss and ferns, scattered fallen leaves and twigs, and artfully placed a few dead branches. When he was finished, the entrance to his fortress was invisible. It looked like nothing more than a patch of unremarkable forest floor. The final hidden detail was a narrow ventilation pipe made from hollowed-out logs, snaked underground for 20 feet before emerging inside a cluster of rocks, ensuring the air in the cache would stay fresh without betraying its location. They finished in late autumn, just as the last leaves were falling and the air grew crisp with the promise of frost. The great mound of excess dirt had been scattered in the woods, the clearing was gone, and the forest floor looked as if it had been undisturbed for a century. From the outside, there was no sign of the massive structure that now occupied the heart of the hill. Caleb and Samuel stood together, looking at the placid, camouflaged ground. The work was done. The folly was complete. A deep sense of quiet satisfaction settled over Caleb. He had done what he set out to do. Now, all he could do was wait. The first test came sooner than he expected, though it was a minor one. A trio of gaunt, desperate-looking men, likely failed prospectors or trappers driven from the high country by an early snow, passed through the valley. They were not the organized, violent raiders Caleb feared, but they were hungry and opportunistic. They moved quietly, avoiding direct contact. One morning, Jarvis awoke to find his smokehouse door pried open and a side of bacon gone. A few of his chickens were missing from their coop. The men had been clumsy, leaving clear tracks in the damp soil. Jarvis was furious, railing against the lack of decency in the world. He followed the tracks with his rifle for a mile before giving up. The tracks led straight through the woods, passing no more than 10 yards from the site of Caleb's hidden cache. They had walked right past it, their eyes scanning for the obvious signs of a homestead, a smokehouse, a barn, the slanted doors of a root cellar, and had seen nothing but trees and earth. Later that day, after Jarvis's anger had subsided into a grumbling resignation, Caleb went to his cache. He pulled aside the branches, lifted the camouflaged turf, and shifted the heavy stone. Reaching down, he worked the hidden latch and lifted the heavy oak hatch. A wave of cool, dry air, smelling faintly of earth and pine, rose to meet him. He descended the ladder into the darkness. Lighting a lantern, he surveyed his work. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The barrels of salted meat, the sacks of flour and cornmeal, the shelves of preserved vegetables in clay jars. All of it was safe. The air was fresh, thanks to his hidden ventilator. It was perfect. The system worked. It was the first moment of true peace he had felt in 5 years. He said nothing to Jarvis about the men's proximity to his own stores. There was no need. But when he saw his neighbor later, patching the flimsy door of his smokehouse, Jarvis just shook his head. "You were lucky, Caleb," he said, not unkindly. "Just dumb luck they didn't stumble across your hidey hole while they were sneaking around. All that digging, and it was just luck that saved you." Caleb nodded quietly. He knew it was not luck. It was design. But he also knew that Jarvis and the rest of the valley would not be convinced by a minor theft. They needed to see the folly stand against a hurricane, not just a breeze. The lingering skepticism was a wall he could not breach with words. Only a true crisis would tear it down. The crisis arrived in the dead of the following winter. Word had trickled through the mountains of a band of men, a dozen strong, made vicious by starvation and defeat. They were said to be former soldiers from some forgotten conflict in the lowlands, men who knew violence and tactics, now turned into predators by the harsh realities of the frontier. They moved like a plague, stripping entire settlements bare. When the first reports placed them in the next valley over, a palpable fear settled over Caleb's community. People barred their doors at night and walked with rifles during the day. The raiders came on a moonless night, under the cover of a driving snowstorm that muffled all sound. They were the superstorm Caleb had prepared for. They moved with a chilling efficiency, striking the most isolated homesteads first. Shouts and the splintering of wood were swallowed by the wind. They were not opportunistic thieves. They were a conquering army in miniature. They overwhelmed families, taking what they wanted by brute force. At Jarvis's homestead, the assault was swift and brutal. They did not bother with the lock on his cabin door. They used a heavy log as a battering ram, shattering the door and its frame in a single explosive impact. Jarvis, armed with an old musket, was knocked aside before he could even fire. The raiders swarmed his home, their hunger making them careless and destructive. They found his root cellar in moments. The classic, obvious slanted doors were a beacon in the swirling snow. They kicked them in, descended into the small stone room, and stripped it bare in minutes, tossing empty sacks and broken pottery aside. They took everything edible, loaded it onto Jarvis's own mule, and set his barn on fire as a final act of contempt before melting back into the storm. Caleb and Samuel had heard the first distant crash from Jarvis's farm. Caleb's face was grim but calm. He had been preparing for this moment for years. "Into the cabin," he said, his voice low and steady. "Bar the door. Put out the lamp." They moved without panic. The cabin door was new, built of thick oak and reinforced with 2 heavy drawbars. The windows were protected by solid wooden shutters, also barred from the inside. Their small home became a dark, silent box. They waited in the blackness, listening. The sounds grew closer. The crunch of many boots in the snow, a low murmur of voices. Then, a heavy thump against their door. Silence. Another, harder thump. The drawbars held. Caleb and Samuel stood side by side, rifles in hand, their backs against the far wall. They heard muttered curses from outside. The men were testing the door, finding it unexpectedly strong. A figure appeared at the shuttered window, prying at it with a crowbar. The wood groaned, but did not splinter. Frustration grew in the attackers' voices. They were accustomed to easy prey. This cabin was proving to be a frustrating delay. "Forget the house," a gruff voice shouted over the wind. "Find the cellar. The food's all that matters." The sounds receded from the cabin walls. Caleb crept to a small peephole he had drilled in one of the shutters. He could see them, dark shapes moving through the white chaos of the blizzard, their lanterns casting wild, dancing shadows. They were searching. They fanned out, methodical and practiced. One group kicked in the door to the small, empty smokehouse. Another went through the barn, finding only a few nervous chickens. The main group began searching the grounds near the cabin, using the butts of their rifles to probe the snow, looking for the telltale outline of a cellar door. They walked everywhere. Caleb's heart pounded as he watched 2 of the men walk directly over the location of the cache. They paused, their boots standing on the very soil that concealed his family's survival, and then moved on. The camouflage was perfect. The snow, which he had feared would show their tracks, was instead the final layer of concealment, a uniform white blanket that made the undisturbed ground indistinguishable from the rest of the landscape. The search grew more frantic, more desperate. The raiders were cold and angry. They had expected an easy prize, but this homestead was yielding nothing. After 15 minutes that felt like an eternity, the gruff voice shouted again, "Nothing here! It's a bust! Let's move on before we freeze." The lanterns converged, and the dark shapes trudged away, disappearing back into the swirling snow. Caleb and Samuel remained in the darkness, listening until the only sound was the howling of the wind. They did not move for another hour. In the woods nearby, huddled in a thicket of pines and shivering uncontrollably, Jarvis and his wife and 2 small children had watched the entire ordeal. They had fled their burning barn with nothing but the clothes on their backs, expecting to see Caleb's home suffer the same fate. Instead, they watched in stunned disbelief as the raiders gave up and left. They saw the most feared men in the mountains defeated by a stubborn door and a patch of empty ground. When the first light of dawn broke, gray and weak, Jarvis approached Caleb's cabin. He was a broken man. His face was smudged with soot, his clothes were singed, and his eyes were hollow with shock and defeat. He knocked weakly on the door he had watched the raiders fail to breach. Caleb unbarred the door and let them in. He gave them blankets and hot broth without a word. After the shivering had subsided, Jarvis looked at him, his pride gone, his skepticism shattered. "They took everything, Caleb. Everything. How did they not find yours?" Caleb took him outside. The world was white and still. He led Jarvis to the unremarkable patch of ground on the slope. He brushed away the snow, revealing the layer of leaves and moss beneath. Jarvis watched, mystified, as Caleb lifted the section of turf like a blanket, revealing the flat stones beneath. He shifted the keystone, reached into the hidden gap, and with a muffled clunk, unlocked the hatch. He heaved the heavy, iron-bound door open, revealing a dark, square hole and a ladder leading down. He lit a lantern and handed it to Jarvis. "Go see." Jarvis descended into the earth. He stepped off the ladder into a space that was larger and drier than his own cabin. He raised the lantern. The light fell upon a scene of impossible abundance. Barrels of food, sacks of grain, tools hanging neatly on the wooden walls. It was a fortress of plenty, an underground keep, untouched and inviolable. He looked up at the ceiling, at the massive interlocking logs, and finally understood the purpose of all those months of digging. This was not a cellar, it was a vault. It was not folly, it was genius. The vindication was absolute, silent, and complete. He climbed back to the surface, blinking in the daylight, his face a mask of awe and shame. He looked at the man he had mocked, the neighbor he had dismissed as a fool. "Caleb," he began, his voice cracking with emotion. "I was wrong. Can you show me how?" That spring, as the valley thawed and the survivors began to rebuild, Caleb became a teacher. He shared his knowledge freely, refusing any offer of payment. When asked why, his answer was always the same. No family should starve because of a broken door. He sketched his designs on birch bark for his neighbors, explaining the principles of the bell-shaped pit, the woven log construction, and the critical importance of the camouflaged, multi-layered entrance. His motivation was not pride, but a deep-seated desire to prevent the tragedy that had shaped his life from ever happening to anyone else. A new kind of structure began to appear throughout the valley. Homesteads were rebuilt with small, defensible cabins, and, nearby, the deep, hidden caches for their vital supplies. They were called Caleb caches at first, a name spoken with reverence instead of ridicule. The designs varied slightly from builder to builder. One man, who had a good source of fieldstone, used flat rocks to line his pit instead of logs. Another, living on a steeper hill, incorporated a clever drainage channel. But the core principles, depth, structural reinforcement against the earth, and a concealed entrance, remained the same. The valley had learned its lesson. It had armored itself against fate. A year later, a traveling trader named Miller passed through the region. He had been through this valley before and remembered it as a place of easy pickings and fearful settlers. Now, he found it changed. The homesteads were more robust, and there was a new confidence in the people. He heard the story of the Great Raid and how only one man's stores had survived. He was shown one of the new caches, and as a man who understood logistics and security, he was deeply impressed. He spent 2 days with Caleb, filling a small notebook with sketches and notes, committing the ingenious design to paper. Miller was the disseminator. As he traveled the frontier, from the rugged hills of Tennessee to the newly settled lands in Ohio, he shared the design. He sold the knowledge along with his wares, describing the mountain vault to settlers who lived in constant fear of raids or simple starvation. The name Caleb Cache did not travel far beyond its home valley. As the design was adapted to new terrains and new materials, it was given new, generic names. In the stony hills, it became the Ridge Runner's Cellar. In the flatlands, where deep digging was easier, it was known simply as a deep store. The idea spread, becoming a piece of frontier common sense, while its origin story and the quiet, determined man at its center were forgotten. The innovation had become anonymous. Decades passed. The world changed. The frontier pushed westward, and the isolated valley became a peaceful, settled community. The threat of raiders faded into legend, stories told by grandfathers to wide-eyed children. Caleb grew old. He lived a quiet life, watching his son Samuel raise a family of his own. The caches he had inspired were still there, hidden beneath the earth, but their primary purpose had been forgotten. They were now used as exceptionally good root cellars, praised for their ability to keep vegetables crisp and meat fresh well into the spring. Their defensive genius, a dormant feature that was no longer needed. When Caleb died, he was buried on the hill next to Mary. His gravestone, carved by his son, was as simple and unadorned as the man himself. It read, "Caleb, husband, father, farmer." There was no mention of his true legacy, no epitaph for the innovator who had fortified an entire region through the force of his will and the pain of his loss. His contribution was written not in stone, but in the enduring safety of the people he had protected. The impact of his log-woven cache was unmeasurable but real. How many families, in how many distant valleys, had survived a harsh winter or a desperate band of thieves because of the anonymous idea he had set loose in the world? How many lives had been saved? How many children had been fed? The numbers were lost to time, but the legacy was as solid and enduring as the structures themselves. Abandoned homesteads, discovered by hunters a century later, would sometimes contain the strange, circular pits, their woven log walls still intact, a mystery to the men who found them. The technique had become so ingrained in the culture of the mountains that it was no longer seen as an invention, but as a piece of timeless ancestral knowledge. On a warm summer afternoon, a young boy, Caleb's great-grandson, played in the woods behind the old family cabin. He chased a grasshopper through the dappled sunlight, his bare feet thudding on the soft ground. His game took him up a gentle, mossy slope, a place he had crossed 1,000 times. With a final, joyful leap, he landed on a small, springy mound, laughing as he startled a squirrel from a nearby branch. He was dancing on the roof of his family's history, completely unaware that just 3 feet beneath his feet lay an invisible fortress of woven logs, a silent testament to the quiet, obsessive man who, driven by love and loss, had taught his people how to hide their hope from the storm.